out that on the one hand you're sort of trying to get out, on the other hand you're trying to get solidarity. I do think, however, that this case goes beyond and has closed some of those gaps and irritations in the European relationship with Britain, because after a very unfortunate start when Jean-Claude Juncker wrote congratulating Vladimir Putin on what was really...
so did Angela Merkel and Donald Trump.
I think they have to write something diplomatic that kind of says you're still the leader of Russia and we'll deal with you. But behind the scenes, I do think Germany has actually been quite active in making an alliance with Britain on this and has persuaded that kind of Brussels machine to kick into life. Angela Merkel, by the way, of course, knows Vladimir Putin. She was coming up through politics in Germany when Vladimir Putin was in the KGB.
Yes, so they're peers in that sense. I mean, does this make Vladimir Putin feel lonely, Tim? The fact that we've got this strong statement from the EU, they're recalling their ambassador. There are 5 countries, France, Latvia, Poland, Lithuania and Estonia, who are going to expel Russian diplomats. Ireland apparently is considering it too. Does this make him isolated?
I don't think it makes him isolated. I think it shows that despite some of what's said about Britain leaving the European Union, we still have diplomatic oomph when we need it. A lot of people said that this sort of statement would have been very difficult for Theresa May, given the Brexit position, to deliver. She's delivered it. But I think unless there's some sort of economic teeth to follow, that actually it's not just diplomatic sanctions, but there's some economic implications for Putin and Russia, I'm not sure he will be too worried.
Right, and on that, the EU has been less forthcoming. I mean, there are sanctions in place anyway, to a certain degree, but further sanctions doesn't seem to be on the table.
Well, further sanctions is maybe not the answer. It's tightening and targeting the sanctions you already have more accurately. We are seeing talk about that, and whatever is said publicly, that does bother people in Moscow. It bothers people if they can't travel as freely or trade as freely. That is a long-term pressure point on Vladimir Putin, not today, not tomorrow, but it bothers the Kremlinocracy more than they like to admit.
We're going to return to Paris, to Hugh Schofield, and try and get some more information about the hostage situation in the south of France. This gunman, who claims to be from the so-called Islamic State group, has stormed the supermarket. Hugh Schofield, is this being treated now as a terrorist incident?
Yeah, it is. The man, it appears, did claim to be from Daesh, as they call it here, and various witnesses have said that he was shouting words that would confirm that thesis, that he had some kind of religious inspiration for what he's done. He's in the supermarket. It's a very unclear situation. It's unfolding now. It does look like there are victims. There are apparently 2 inanimate bodies on the floor of this supermarket, which have been seen from outside. There are other reports from officials saying that there are 2 dead. So whether that corresponds with the 2 apparent bodies would seem logical. Other reports of injured people, and other reports of some kind of contact between the gendarmerie, who were at the scene, obviously in force, and the man inside. But I have to say, I can't see this lasting very long. You know, the sort of standing orders now in this kind of situation is yes, to make contact, but they don't hang around waiting to see if they can talk him down like they would with a man who, I don't know, had some sort of desperate family situation. This is the order is to move fast. So I think what's happening is that they'll be getting elite squads in position, and I would not expect this to last very long, this standoff at all.
Hugh Schofield, thank you very much for bringing us up to date. I know you probably have to go and investigate this story further, but we will bring you, viewers, any changing developments throughout the programme. Now, the Prime Minister was due to fly home from Brussels last night. That was the plan, at least, before mixed messages from the White House on steel forced the EU to delay trade talks. Earlier this month, President Trump announced higher duties on steel and aluminium coming into the US, citing what he called threats to national security. The measures are largely aimed at China, which says it will fight to the end in any trade war with the US. Last night, he announced the EU would be exempt from the tariffs until May the 1st. Well, Theresa May has stayed in Brussels to join those EU trade talks this morning, meaning she's likely to be around for the European Council's press conference on Brexit. Here's what she told the BBC earlier.
We have made significant progress in the Brexit negotiations. Obviously, the EU Council will be looking to endorse the agreement that we reached earlier in the week with the European Union about the implementation period. We've made good progress on the withdrawal agreement, but also I'm looking for a new dynamic in the next stage of the negotiations so that we can ensure that we do develop, that we work together to negotiate and develop that strong future economic and security partnership, which I believe is in the interests of the UK and the European Union. Thank you.
Theresa May there. Well, let's get the latest from the BBC's Adam Fleming, who is at the summit. So, Adam, the deal is sealed on transition and negotiating guidelines. What are those?
Right, so it's a 7-page document that sets out the EU's blueprint for how they see the talks about the future relationship unfolding. So that's all the stuff about trade and cooperation on security and defence, the broad principles of what the EU wants to get out of that process. First of all, I'd highlight paragraph 1. That's the really newsy bit today and the one that they were wrangling over all week. It, first of all, welcomes the progress made this week on agreeing those bits of the Brexit Treaty. Remember all the bits that have been coloured in green, including the transition period. The Brits are glad about that because they say it gives an extra level of certainty to that political agreement about the transition phase. However, if you read paragraph 1 carefully, it says that old mantra of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. In other words, the transition period is part of the whole Brexit Treaty. So you don't really get your transition period signed off officially until the whole Brexit Treaty has been signed off officially, and we know that process won't start until October.
Right, and on the basis of that, where does that leave those 3 options then in terms of the Irish border, that backstop position that the British government rejects, but Michel Barnier says must still be part of any legal text?
So the two sides have managed to find a compromise solution to get them to this point where the leaders could sign off on this document, which is that the UK acknowledges there has to be a backstop option and there has to be negotiations on the basis of that backstop option. They're going to start talking about Ireland in a separate negotiation strand as soon as next week. What I would say, though, is that today's document is less about that. That's withdrawal-related stuff for the Brexit Treaty. The document today is all about the talks about the future, and the way Michel Barnier sees the future relationship is it being based on 4 pillars. Number 1, a free trade agreement with no tariffs on goods. Number 2, a partnership on security. Number 3, a partnership on defence and foreign policy. And number 4, a whole load of other areas where they'll cooperate on, from transport to education to research to culture. And that's what they're going to be discussing in the next few months, and they can start discussing it now because Michel Barnier has been given the green light to start those talks. Worth remembering what the EU says is the best case scenario for the final product on this process. It's a political declaration to go alongside the Brexit Treaty. So a political document where the leaders spell out in very generally what they want the future relationship to look like, not a 1,600-page page-turner trade agreement like the one the EU did with Canada. Page-turner,
I like the use of the phrase there. But anyway,
it
is for you and many others, I'm sure. We'll be testing you on the full contents. Anything else that is going to happen in the next sort of few weeks in terms of moving ahead on transition, on EU Council heads meeting? Anything else before the withdrawal agreement, as you say, is dealt with again?
So the main thing that we know for definite that's going to happen in the next few days is those talks about Ireland on that backstop option, and also trying to find ways to make that work that are palatable to the UK. Now Michel Barnier has been given the green light to talk about the future relationship. What I'm keen to hear about from Team Barnier is how they see that working in practice. Do they have to release more position papers or directives where they flesh out the instructions they've been given today, or can they just start talking about it now? Then there'll be an EU summit again in June where they'll review progress, and we'll get a really good idea of where things are heading then. And an intriguing bit in the guidelines, I think it's paragraph 16, I wish I had it to hand so I could be specific, but it's called the evolution clause. And basically there is where the EU say, if the UK is prepared to compromise on its red lines, they're prepared to make a new offer that's much more ambitious and much closer. However, that is the UK keeping a door open to the UK retaining membership of the single market and the customs union.
Yes. Those famous red lines. Adam Fleming, thank you very much. Well, listening to all that, apart from my guests here in the studio, of course, is the German MEP David Mcallister. He is chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament and a close ally of Angela Merkel. Welcome to the programme. The European Council have approved their guidelines for the negotiations for the future relationship with the UK. Is this significant progress in your view, David?
Well, I welcome the decision taken today here in Brussels. This is a major step forward, but of course we have to keep moving because we only have 7 months' time now to conclude the Brexit negotiations on a political, technical level.
Is it real progress, though, when the EU position still seems to be the same as it's always been, which is that the UK cannot have a bespoke deal that involves goods and services?
Well, the British government has set the framework for our future relationship by designing a few red lines. And these red lines are to leave the European Union, to leave the single market, to leave the customs union, and also not to accept the free movement of people. So the best we can offer is a tailor-made association agreement based on 4 pillars, a free trade agreement and close cooperation on external affairs and security, internal security and other issues.
Right. But, David, do you accept that when Theresa May said in her last speech on Brexit that actually for both sides to meet our objective, she said we need to look beyond the precedents and find a new balance? The red lines that you have just outlined there, that's clear from the British government. But this is a new situation, isn't it? This is a member state leaving. This isn't about a trade deal with a country that's never been part of the EU. So do you accept that we need to look beyond what's been done before?
We have to accept that the United Kingdom wants to leave the European Union and the single market, but the UK government has set a certain framework through these red lines I just tried to describe. So all we can really offer is an association agreement, a free trade agreement plus thematic cooperation on other issues. But one thing is clear. To leave the European Union, to leave the single market, cannot be just the same as being a member of the European Union. So our future relationship will depend very much on what the UK is ready to offer, because of course in the end we need a balance of rights and obligations, and we need a level playing field. We are willing to have as close possible partnership with the UK, but the ball is now definitely in the British court.
But are you really prepared to do that? I mean, it does require a leap of faith from the EU side. Theresa May has made it clear she has to respect the result of the referendum, and that means, and has, according to the government, always meant leaving the single market and the customs union. And therefore, the EU has stayed static in terms of its position. There hasn't been any movement from the EU to the sort of fundamental principles here that are being dealt with. And every trade deal is bespoke. So why can't this one be?
First of all, we deeply regret that the UK is leaving the European Union, but we have to accept the decision. And it's a British decision to not only leave the EU, but also the single market and the customs union. I'm not sure that was actually on the ballot paper at the referendum in 2016, but OK. But since the UK is so determined not to respect the rulings of the European Court of Justice, not to accept the free movement of people and other points, this of course brings us in a position that we can only offer a tailor-made association agreement. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Because despite the British leaving the European Union, I strongly believe that the UK will remain an important neighbour, NATO ally and trade partner. So let's try and make the best out of this situation and let's get Brexit done in an orderly fashion.
And do you accept that the British government gave way on quite a few things for the transition deal to be done, whether it was on EU citizens' rights or fishing rights and fishing waters? What's the EU given way on?
Well, the transition period gives us vital breathing space, and that is important. But of course, the transition period comes at a price, because on the one hand, the UK will have full access to the single market. That is beneficial for businesses and citizens. But on the other hand, the price is that you have to accept the rules of the European Union. We are a rules-based entity, and this was very clear from the beginning.
Yes.
But what the UK gets is that we avoid a cliff-edge Brexit, and that is, of course, a big advantage that for another 21 months' time, until the end of 2020, we have time to smoothen the consequences of Brexit.
So you don't see any further movement in order to bring the two sides closer together on those key issues of a close relationship, but still Britain leaving the single market and the customs union?
Well, Article 50 requires that we get a deal done on the framework of our future relationship. That means a lot of the details of our future relationship will have to be clarified during the transition period. But now we should use the next few months' time until the end of October to try and get a rather detailed framework, what exactly the British want. And once again, we didn't ask for this divorce. The UK is asking for this divorce. This is okay. But then it's up to the British to make concrete proposals how we can solve all these problems.
David, I'm going to talk to you in a moment just about the EU's response to Russia, but I'm just going to talk to the guests in the studio to react to what you have said. What do you make of David's response? He's sticking very firmly to the line that there will not be a cherry-picking bespoke deal using all the phrases that have been bandied about over the last year or so.
I've always listened to David very carefully. He's one of the most pro-British MEPs, and his solidarity with our country is hugely appreciated, and I put that on record. But I do worry at the inflexibility of the European Union, not just with respect to Britain in these talks, but if you look at what happened in the Italian elections recently, with well over 50% of people voting for populist parties, people protesting at the implications of the euro and the freedom of movement for their country. You look at what's happening in Central European, in Hungary and Poland. This is a European Union facing huge problems, not just with Britain, but across the continent, who are worried at the central features of the European Union's project. And at some point, if people like David, who I think have a real understanding of the British situation, don't start being more flexible and realising that this one-size-fits-all Brussels model cannot continue to fit all, we aren't going to be the last country to leave the European Union. Others will start to want to detach themselves too. And I'm not hearing any real understanding of the significance of the challenges that Europe's facing.
What do you say to that, David?
Well, I strongly believe that EU countries are stronger and better off within the European Union. Together we are stronger. Together we are a single market of nearly 500 million citizens and consumers. And if we want to have an eye level with other powers in the world, including the United States or China or India or Russia, we are stronger and better off together. But I accept the decision of the British government, the British politics, the British people to leave the European Union. But once again, we have to get this done on a rule-based order. We are a legal entity with rules and regulations.
Right. I don't think, David, you answered.
By the way, I don't think flexibility during the negotiations.
OK, I don't think you answered the question at the core of what Tim was saying, which is actually that there are many people who are unhappy with the way the EU runs its affairs and the way it's structured, and that has led to the rise of populist parties, extreme parties, parties who are anti the EU. You haven't addressed that issue, and that is because the EU is standing still.
We have to reform the European Union. Of course, the European Union has to be better. It has to be more effective, less bureaucratic. We have to explain European politics better to our citizens. But if there's one positive thing about Brexit, an event which I deeply regret, is that Brexit was a wake-up call for the other 27 member states, because we are now seeing that there is an alternative to being a member of the European Union. The alternative is to leave the European Union with all the consequences. So let's make Europe better. Let's make Europe bigger on big things and smaller on small things. But I still strongly believe that a European Union with the United Kingdom would be a better place than without the United Kingdom.
Anne.
Well, I think there, you see the clash, don't you, between what David Mcallister calls that rules-based order, that is what the EU is and what it's built on, and then what is reinforced through the European Court of Justice, and the plea, which comes, I suppose, from Britain as we try to negotiate Brexit, but as I think Tim is right, from others, to have a more flexible instance, something where you could have a sort of outer core relationship with the EU. I also think this is something that would be desirable. I don't see it as being on the table at the moment. Otherwise, we'd probably have been offered transitional deals or sort of fudges on freedom of movement, which was not what was coming. Having said that, I spent a lot of time in Berlin looking at it from that end of the telescope. And as David reflected, the view is still very much, well, you opted to leave. You wanted this messy divorce. Now you're coming to us saying, can you please be nicer to us after this messy divorce? My view is it's a sum-zero game, this. It doesn't help on either side. The British government needs to be much, much clearer about what kind of Brexit it ultimately wants. We saw a bit of progress there. I think Theresa May starting now to step out a bit and put her own voice behind it. We've had basically at least three and a half forms of Brexit on the table for too long. To that extent, I understand the frustrations in Brussels and in Berlin.
All right, let's get your reaction, David, to the situation in terms of relations with Russia. Do you think it would be wise for Germany to expel Russian diplomats?
I very much welcome the decision of the EU heads of state and government today to show clear solidarity with the United Kingdom, and that this attack on British soil is an attack on all of us, and we stand very closely with our EU and NATO partner, the United Kingdom. And as a first reaction, the EU will now withdraw our EU ambassador in Moscow for 4 weeks.
And Germany?
And we will have to wait and see if further actions and sanctions are possible. Angela Merkel said today that she wants to wait until we have the final result of the external investigation of this matter.
Okay.
And then possible further steps might be required.
David, I think we're about to lose the line, so we better finish our interview there. Thank you very much for joining us today. For more reporting and analysis of Brexit, check out the BBC News website. That's bbc.co.uk/Brexit. Now, another major issue still to be agreed in the Brexit talks is how to maintain an open Irish border. We mentioned it a little bit earlier. All parties are agreed it's an essential outcome. But it's not clear yet exactly how it can be achieved, although Sinn Féin are calling for Northern Ireland to be given special status by the EU. Earlier this year, Gerry Adams stepped down as Sinn Féin president and was succeeded by Mary Lou MacDonald. She's a member of the Irish Parliament and used to be an MEP. In her first speech as the new president, she warned that Brexit could represent a real threat to the island's prosperity. And Mary Lou MacDonald joins us now to discuss Brexit and the outlook for power sharing in Northern Ireland. Welcome to the Daily Politics. But first of all, you're welcome. I mean, people know who Gerry Adams is. He's been around an awfully long time. He's a familiar name and face. Tell us who you are.
Who I am. I'm a Dubliner, firstly and foremostly. I grew up in the city. I'm elected to the Dáil for the inner city part of Dublin on the north side. It's a very historic part of the city. I spent 5 years in the European Parliament representing the city. I'm a mother. I have 2 children, aged 12 and almost 15, so she shrugs a lot at me now. And I have come into post, I'm just about 6 weeks now. So I don't know how to give a potted account to you of myself to you.
It's just for our viewers who may not have seen you before or heard of you before.
No, I take your point that obviously the leadership of Sinn Féin now is in the hands of a new generation. Unlike Gerry and his generation, I fortunately didn't live through the conflict in the north. So it's a new beginning and it's an exciting time for Irish Republican politics.
Let's talk about the border issue and Brexit. How critical is it, in your mind, to deal with that issue now? Or are you happy for it to be postponed a little bit further down the line before it's agreed?
No, absolutely not. In fact, I'm listening to your panel's frustration on certain levels with the whole Brexit and exit process. Our frustration is that although we have a solid assertion from the British government that 2 things need to be achieved. Firstly and critically, the protection of our peace agreements. And secondly, to ensure that there is no hardening of the border. That has been their position, despite some of the soundings from some of Theresa May's cabinet. And yet, so far, we have seen precisely nothing, zilch, zero, by way of real proposition to achieve those 2 goals. We have suggested, and it's not just Sinn Féin's position, it's the position of the Irish Parliament, that the north of Ireland, having voted to remain within the EU, and given the fact that we have a 300-mile border, an extremely porous border, given the fact that from the European point of view, view, the single market has to be protected, given from our point of view that Ireland needs to be protected, that the solution is to keep the North inside the customs union and inside the single market.
Tim.
Well, it's a very difficult issue to resolve, because I think there are people with long-standing historical views on these issues between Ireland and the UK, and I think some people are making quite a lot of politics out of this, including Sinn Féin. I think it's hard to resolve the issue of exactly arrangements that we put in place until we know what kind of deal the whole of the UK will have with the European Union in terms of a trade and customs union arrangement. You can't really solve the specific problem of the border with your country until we've solved the general relationship that Britain has with the European Union.
So I have listened to your very interesting exchange. You've talked about the inflexibility of the Europeans, and you may have merit in that analysis.
Do you think they have been inflexible?
No, I think they've been firm, and I think if you expected them to be anything other than that, you were slightly delusional, quite frankly. And I'm a critic of the European project. I agree that it needs to change. My analysis from across the water, looking on at your debate, is that much of it was driven by frustrations with the Europe that's not just inflexible, but a Europe that's all for the big corporates.
Absolutely.
And people say, well, where's the dividend for the citizen? I'm very sympathetic to that, but I want to tell you this about Ireland. You see, this is very straightforward. You had your vote. It's not for me to gainsay that. That's your democratic decision. But Ireland cannot be the collateral damage in all of this.
But do you accept that if you did the free trade agreement and it was comprehensive enough, that that might solve this conundrum in terms of the border?
No, I don't see that happening. To be honest with you, we need to be frank and honest and respectful with each other. And we need upfront, I think Donald Tusk referred to it as a policy of Ireland first, rather than pushing Ireland down the pipe and asking us to wait. We have to know with absolute certainty and with legal clarity that there will be no hardening of the border, that the Good Friday Agreement, which is an international agreement, will be recognised, will be respected and will not be dismantled.
Right, and that means a backstop position that has been rejected by the government. So how does that get resolved in the first instance? There's going to be an insistence that that is in that legal text, and yet the government says not.
Well, it really depends on the kind of weighting that you give to it as the process goes on. I mean, Tim was arguing to leave it till the end. I think politically probably something will have to be clearer before then, but where I'm afraid I just don't agree with the Sinn Féin position is really towards the end of what you said in your first remarks. You were suggesting that basically Northern Ireland was simply sort of taken out as, Northern Ireland is kind of part of this, whether it voted separately, so did other parts of the UK. And I think what you'd be doing would have obviously advanced the cause of Irish republicanism if you said that Northern Ireland stayed in the customs union and the single market, which is, of course, a political aim of Sinn Féin. But it is clearly at odds with the idea that the Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and you can't get away from that.
The difficulty with that is, well, we can, and we actually have a mechanism agreed in that international agreement where the issue of the border and partition will be addressed in good time. But for now, I take your point. I know where jurisdiction lies. But I think it's a bit ironic, on the one hand, to criticise others for a lack of flexibility, and then to be so stuck and inflexible in your own view on this. The reality is Irish jobs, Irish livelihoods, north and south, Irish farming, the social fabric of our country, our political institutions, our peace depends on ensuring.
This is what I think incredibly dangerous. This saying that peace is somehow in danger because of the border arrangements that might be or might not be put in place. This sort of playing really dangerous politics, and I'm afraid there are people like Arlene Foster, the First Minister, on the other side of the Unionist nationalist debate from you, but she believes that this can work. Former Northern Ireland secretaries like Owen Paterson think that something could be put in place. You're, I'm afraid, playing politics with this. Sinn Féin has a motivation.
It is called the daily politics, is it not?
and I'm afraid there's some people who don't want to find a solution
well, let Mary
to
Lou,
this
because you said that.
And I'm afraid
Mary Lou,
you
can answer Tim's question, but can you answer this at the same time? If you want to influence Brexit, should Sinn Féin MPs just take their seats in Parliament?
No, is the short answer to that. And can I just say, Tim, as interesting as your analysis is, we are actually elected by people in Ireland, North and South. We actually believe that you have to the democratic fact that the people in the north of Ireland voted to remain. And by the way, just for purposes of clarity, I'm not sounding alarm as regards a return to conflict. God forbid, we're never going back there. And I'm not saying that. I have said something very different and I want you to hear it. Our peace agreements, that means the institutions of government, not just in the north but north to south, have to be protected. You cannot do that as the British government claim they wish to do and have to do, and at the same time insist that the north comes out of the customs union and the single market.
What about infrastructure? I mean, I've never quite envisaged what it means to have this completely invisible border. Would cameras for you be seen as infrastructure that you wouldn't support?
So I don't know if any of it. Actually, what you might do is broadcast an episode of this programme from the border region in Ireland, and you see it's 300 miles long. It is as porous as this. You could walk in your front door in the southern jurisdiction and go into your back garden in the north. So you are not going to get a technological solution to sort that out. And in any event, it's not just about traffic going to and fro. But
there isn't a border like that anyway. I mean, obviously, yes, at the moment, but in terms of Norway and Sweden, there's infrastructure there.
But it's about regulatory alignment. It's about same rules.
Can I just break in on briefly?
No, because fascinating though this is, we will have to do a programme.
Norway,
I think
Sweden's not about that.
We have to say goodbye. Just yes or no, should Ireland expel Russian diplomats?
I don't know. I haven't got a considered view on that, but I've watched it with alarm. Like others, I understand that Taoiseach is considering that, and of course we've been party to the European Statement of Solidarity.
All right, thank you very much for coming in today. Now, the gender pay gap, it's a hot topic at the moment, isn't it always? Companies with more than 250 employees have to publish their figures in the next few weeks, but what actually does it mean? It's the percentage difference between average hourly earnings for men and women. The average being the midpoint between highest and lowest earners. There's no one reason behind the gender pay gap. It's a complex issue. Women are more likely to work, certainly historically, in part-time roles, which are often lower paid or have fewer opportunities for progression. Women are also more likely to take on caring responsibilities for children or elderly relatives. The gender pay gap is not the same thing as pay inequality, where men and women are paid less for doing the same job. That's been illegal since the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1970. So a company might have a gender pay gap if a majority of men fill top jobs in the boardroom and still have no issue with equal pay. Medium and large companies have to publish their gender pay gap figures over the next few weeks. Public sector employers by the 30th of March and private companies by the 4th of April. The clock is ticking, as Michel Barnier likes to say. Well, joining me now are Sophie Jarvis from the Entrepreneurs Network and Rebecca Hilsenrath from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. They're the body responsible for making sure that employers comply with the law on gender pay gap reporting. Welcome to both of you. Rebecca, first of all, what powers do you have to make companies publish this information?
We're the body that's charged with statutory enforcement of the Equality Act. We're quite clear that the law is that the gender pay gap must be published after the deadline expires, which is next week if you're a public sector employer, the week after in the private sector. After that, we'll be writing to every organisation in breach, and we will be conducting enforcement proceedings to enforce them to publish.
Right, and those enforcement proceedings will consist of what?
It's a statutory investigation, and it can result in a summary conviction and unlimited fine.
Right, and how many companies have filed their data so far?
Upwards of about 2,500.
Do you welcome this?
I do, but I think we've got to be really careful about how we interpret the data. So, for example, I think you see a lot of sort of headline figures such as the HSBC 60% gender pay gap. And I think that's actually quite dangerous if you sort of just look at it like that, because if you actually break it down, as you explained, it's not that men and women are getting paid differently for doing the same jobs. They're actually doing different jobs. I think that's something we should really highlight and really sort of present clearly.
Do you think it's a good idea, though, to publicly name and shame companies who aren't actually doing the very least, it seems, in terms of making these figures public?
Well, I think companies by law have to publish them. So I think, yes.
So you think public naming and shaming will have an impact? Do you think it'll actually make them change some of their policies?
Yes, I think it will, yes.
I mean, When you say there are sanctions that can be brought to bear, what are you hoping is going to happen as a result of this?
I think what we're hoping is what happens afterwards. I think the gender pay gap regulations are about shining a light on the gaps that exist at the moment. What we want to see is companies saying, OK, that's not good, what are we going to do about it? We want to see them looking at their flexible working practices. We want to see them looking at their efforts to tackle conscious and unconscious bias in recruitment, their promotion policies. We want to see them counting the number of women around their senior leadership table, and we want to see them asking themselves what are they doing about women who go out on maternity leave and don't come back. Right,
so it is about promoting more women to senior positions, to better paid jobs. Is that what you would like to see in the way that Rebecca's just outlined?
I think so, but I certainly don't think we should go down the avenue of quotas. Particularly in Norway, they sort of impose quotas there, and you don't actually see a reduction in the gender pay gap there at all via quotas. I think you know, creating role models for women through the media is a really good way of reducing the gender pay gap and sort of, you know, making sure women are getting those top jobs.
What do you take away from information that will be published then from these companies in terms of the gender pay gap? Is it much more about parents and children and working patterns and flexible working patterns?
Well, it probably is, but that doesn't mean to say that it's not a good idea to have the blunt data. My worry about the data is that it is it's gameable. I mean, all data reporting is gameable, and huge companies are very, very good at this. So I would like to see things broken down a lot more, say, by divisions. I mean, what I do see is a lot of companies coming out with an overall figure, and then sometimes it can be terribly embarrassing, and you may have a point. Maybe the HSBC position on the inside is not quite as sort of crass as it looks, but more often they find a way to report the data where it looks less damaging to them. So I would actually like to see, that's not something I think we should crack the whip by law, but there's a lot of pressure now on the corporates in public life. I think a lot of us should just get out there and say, yeah, that's all very good, but it's not the whole story, tell us more.
Yes.
I think that is a better way to go. To your question, I think you're absolutely right. I'm sorry whoever made the point about women not coming back from maternity leave. That's certainly it. But it's also about recruitment, and I think recruiters are some of the laziest people in this market. For years and years, I've known so many women, very able women, say to me, I went out of the workforce to have my babies, or I went and spent some time at home. In that time, I was governor of a difficult school. I did 100 interesting things. When it comes to the headhunters, they look down and say, you weren't doing the same thing as the bloke for the last 5 years. We'll put his name forward. That's what needs to change.
Right, and how do you progress that?
Well, I think it is important not to sort of just to dwell on the fact that actually between the ages of 25 and 39, the gender pay gap is actually negligible, and I think that should be something that's definitely more promoted and wouldn't